Not seeing the wood for the trees is a sort of selective blindness we all understand because we all suffer from it at times. Here in these islands, we are surrounded by trees of a sort anyway, but that too often go unseen especially and shamefully by those that claim to lead. Unremarked are the trees I'm talking about. Ignored are the trees I'm talking about, disregarded as though they were of no value. Worst of all, overlooked as though they weren't even there. But the trees I'm talking about are there all right. The trees I'm talking about are the people, real people. Every day, some of those people, those real people, stop me to talk. For a few minutes, we talk together about some of what we think is wrong with Britain and the wider world. The people I talk to know what's wrong all around them without having to be told. It's called common sense, often in tones of the utmost frustration and disbelief at what they see all around them. They're people with families, people with jobs, people with a sense of responsibility, who know what's what, who know what's right. Most of those folk are the sort that keep the world moving forward. They're the sort that make things, fix things, deliver things, that do the things everyone counts on every day. They happen to be the sort of people I've always lived among, my fellow travellers, people who understand me and I understand in return instinctively without having to think about it. When I was working in South Africa, a lot of years ago now, good people there were in the habit of describing anyone straightforward, sensible and useful as an oak. I don't know if they still do that, but at the time it struck me as meaningful. It also made me think about how back here in the old country of Britain, we've learned to say that nearly all the oak trees are gone, which is true, that our ancestors cut them down to build houses, to build the ships of Nelson's navy, all of that. It's true that all of that shipbuilding and house building changed the landscape of Britain, that the old oak trees are thin on the ground. But still, the oak tree is synonymous with Britain and with what it means to be British. Hearts of oak, we say, of the best of our kind. The oak tree is slow grown, long lived, 1,000-year lifespan for each one. Strong, resilient, a protector of all that lives in its shadow. Long ago, people learned to admire the oak. Druids paid them special attention, to say the least. Druid is an old word that means something like the people that know the oak trees. Long ago, our ancestors cut down most of the oak trees, that much is true. But also true is that oak trees are all around us yet, in another form. The oak trees I'm talking about are those people I mentioned before, that do things, build and make things, fix things, that do the things we count on every day. They're also the people that get on about their business without asking for any help. They don't need help, and they don't want interference. They certainly don't want or willingly tolerate interference from people in authority who know nothing about nothing. What breaks my heart is that the powers that be completely disregard, ignore and dismiss those people, those oaks. If the powers that be see those people at all, then they count them as less than nothing, surplus to requirements. Indeed, if they notice them now, it's to disparage them, call them names, Little Englanders, fascists, white supremacists, nationalists, white van man. This disregarding of an entire class of people who just want to work to build better lives for themselves and their families, is a disgrace. In America, Hillary Clinton dismissed them as a basket of deplorables, by which she meant anyone who didn't agree with her. Justin Trudeau of Canada described people that wouldn't take the so-called vaccines as racists and misogynists. He called the truckers far right, seized their bank accounts. Peaceful protesters were jailed. Farmers standing in the face of attempts to take their land, to end generations of food production, and others like them all across Europe are vilified as far-right extremists. Protests against lockdown by the sort of real people I'm talking about were ignored, ridiculed, violence was meted out upon them. That this happened disgusts me. More and more the policies being pursued in the West are revealed as simply anti-human. What do most people want after all? A home of their own, a family, a job, peace to get on with it. Also peace in the world. Most people in the world want peace. Instead, what do they get? They get needled incessantly about things that are no business of the authorities. Those authorities come after people's cars, the way people can heat their homes. People are needled about the food they eat. At school, their children are taught that mum and dad might not be the people to listen to about much of anything, and certainly not about such matters as whether they should be content with the bodies they were born in, the names they were given. The anti-human agenda tells people who just want to be left alone to work and raise families unmolested, that they are to blame for the imminent ending of life on Earth. The anti-human agenda tells hard-working people to pay no attention to decay in the homeland, to failing infrastructure, breathtaking price rises on food and fuel and every other damn thing, to systemic corruption in the institutions, in the banks, to failing standards of education. Ignore all that, those people are told, and watch us send billions of pounds to corrupt nations thousands of miles away for pointless, endless wars. Ignore that you don't feel safe at home. Ignore the potholes on the roads. Ignore all that, those people are told. And if anyone raises their voice to object, they have their noses rubbed in the fact there's not a damn thing they can do about it. What breaks my heart is that those people, descendants of hundreds of generations of others like them, deeply rooted in the soil of this place, are overlooked as though they don't matter, as though they never mattered, as though they have nothing to give, as though this country and the world would be better off without them. They're even ridiculed for that sense of belonging, that sense of place. The anti-humanists want to take an axe to all of that, to cut everyone everywhere away from their roots, so that they feel disconnected, belonging nowhere, and therefore anywhere, rootless as tumbleweed. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, this cutting of the roots of people. Every religion, every ideology, every leader of a popular movement has employed it, and it works every time. This behaviour by the latest ideologues and authoritarians is as deliberate as it is cynical. They wield the axe to separate us one from another, to cleave us into smaller and smaller groups, so that all the little groups might be set at each other's throats, whether it's on the grounds of race or religion, anything to stoke the fires. All the heat, all the anger is between groups when it should simply be all of us against the few of them. We don't even have to like each other while we deal with them. My enemy's enemy is my friend, remember, and all of us have a common foe. The solution for everyone begins with seeing that it's happening, all this division, all this driving of hatred and fear, and it's being done on purpose by the only ones who ever profit and benefit from the resultant chaos, which is the few. Where is the leader who will notice, far less care, what might be built of such a forest of oaks? There are towering oaks all around us, and any leader could receive no greater honour in this life than to have the respect of those people. Those people are still here, long after most of the oak trees felled long ago, and someone with the wit could stand within, alongside those oaks, and make something unbeatable. It's an open goal we have before us. Parliament's rotten. The institutions are rotten. The judiciary, the civil service, the media, rotten. The fiat currencies are Ponzi schemes, rotten. All of it, the whole damn system, the whole damn state is rotten. Anyone with a mind to could knock it all down. It's an open goal, and anyone with half a mind could enlist those people that make and fix and do, empower them and have them dig out all the decay and set about the straightforward, easier work of building something new, something fresh and something clean. Here's the thing, these anti-human authorities are powerless in the face of the many, but only when the many realise and accept that they're being played yet again by the few, provoked into fighting each other when all that anger might usefully be pointed not from side to side at the neighbours, but upwards to where all the evil lies, where all the trouble in the world comes from. In spite of all I've just been talking about, in spite of all the fear porn, all the censorship, the deliberate and cynical conjuring into being of one war after another, one scamdemic after another, one existential crisis after another, in spite of all that, frankly, I honestly think because of all that, the many are finally believing less and less of what they're told. In fact, the Oaks believe none of it. That will be our strength. That is how we will prevail, together, in the face of the axe being wielded against us. I'm joined tonight by presenter Jasmine Birtles. Hello, Jasmine.
Hello there.
Always good to have you here.
Thank you.
To share the hours.
Yeah.
As I said, it breaks my heart that the people, the good people, are just ignored.
Totally.
Where is the leader that will recognise the people for what they are and what they're capable of?
Well, any leader that's doing that is now being branded a far-right extremist, dangerous, someone like Geert Wilders, someone like Robert Fico in Slovakia, who has just been shot, as we know. And it is truly shocking that our media, few media, certainly in the UK, have basically said, well, you know, He asked for it. He's too right-wing. He was against the Ukraine war. He was against lockdowns, things like that. And so that is essentially what they're saying.
And he spoke about the WHO and the changes to the international health regulations and so on, and pointed out what ought to be glaringly obvious to everyone by now, that that's a power grab by unelected, unaccountable centralists.
Yes, where have we heard that before? Extraordinary, isn't it? It seems to keep happening all over the place. And as you were talking about the oaks, the trees around us, I was also thinking how ironic it is that those, I wouldn't say environmentalists, I would say political environmentalists, those who've greenwashed themselves and are pretending that what they're doing is for our good, the ecological good, they hate trees. I mean, anytime you have these sort of political environmentalists, they get power, they cut down all the trees. They did it in Plymouth. You remember that? And also, they seem to hate flora and fauna generally. I mean, now in this country, incredibly, if you happen to have chickens in your back garden, which is something, if I had a back garden, I'd have them, you have to register them. And now, I just put something on my Twitter about New Zealand. The New Zealand government is forcing, they're burning bee boxes. What?
Hives.
What hives? Exactly, they're burning hives because they say, oh, they've got mites. That is not a reason to burn them. I don't get it, but there really seems to be an assault from the so-called ecologically friendly leaders that we have across the world.
You're right, that Agenda 2030, or whatever you want to call it, which sells itself as caring for a sustainable future, the planet, and all life upon it, seems quite the opposite, quite the contrary, to care about nothing and to care about people least of all.
Yes, and I mean, hence the hatred of farmers. Again, one of my Twitter followers said that in India, the farmers there are being absolutely hammered. We've seen what's been happening in Europe. Geert Wilders, as far as I can see, has come into power on the back of the anger of the Dutch farmers. Farmers in this country are on their knees pretty much, but they're getting together now. And there is this extraordinary hatred of farming, of cows. Cows have been vilified. Cows, for goodness sake. And it's a weird thing that wherever you have these political ecologists, political environmentalists, they get rid of trees, they'll get rid of fields and put metal and glass, you'll have this sort of solar panels, but they seem to hate places where you've got, the usual sort of bucolic scene that we've grown up with nice sheep and cows.
And which is why it seems absolutely obvious to me that were there to be a leader who would... These people are waiting.
Yeah.
The people that understand all of this, that appreciate the landscape, that know how to care for it, that know how to build and make and fix. They just need one person, to let them go, in a sense.
Yes.
Not even to lead, just to stand within them and let them get on with what it is that they do.
True. I think these people exist, but the level of courage that it takes to be that person and to stand against all the establishments, against academia, particularly against media, against the civil service, all of which are railed against and backed, of course, by the WHO and the WEF and the UN, all that sort of thing. They are railed against any sort of individualism, any sort of support of the people that you've been talking about, those hearts of oak.
And it's just the people. It's just the people need to be let loose. We're on a break, after which I will be taking a look at the Scottish COVID-19 inquiry, asking what its findings have been so far. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Please don't go away. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. Now, the UK COVID-19 inquiry is currently sitting in Edinburgh, the Scottish part of that inquiry, as it probes the devolved administration's response to the pandemic. Joining me to discuss this is consultant pathologist Dr. Claire Craig. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Neil.
Have you been keeping up with the testimony, let's say, that's been given to both of these inquiries?
I have been watching it, and it has been really quite shocking. And it really stands in contrast to the English inquiry, because these are real people telling their own stories in a way that we haven't seen in England.
What has been the nature of the inquiry in England? What's been the style and the content then?
So in England, what we've predominantly seen is people who are already in positions of power going and defending their decision-making. Whereas what we're seeing in Scotland are people whose lives are affected getting to finally be heard. I've
seen some of it, and I'll be the first to admit, I haven't been on top of it as much as I should have done as another observer. It's unbelievable testimony that people are coming forward with about. It's beyond neglect.
It really is, and it's really, really important, because what they're doing is lifting the lid on what happened in care homes in spring 2020. And that is such a fundamental part of the COVID story. So 46% of the deaths in Scotland that were attributed to COVID happened in care homes. So if that story isn't quite the one that we've been told, it's important that it gets heard.
Jasmine, it is quite astonishing, is it not, that these stories are being told, and by and large, the general population still are unaware.
It drives me nuts, because, as you say, this is really important. We've got people, real ordinary people who have suffered terrible things, actually getting the chance to say something. But the mainstream media is not covering it. And I think it's because, generally speaking, it can't bear to. The editors, the journalists can't bear to admit that they were wrong and that they were part of this, because it's not just the care homes, it's not just the medical establishment, it's the government, it is the media, it's the civil service. Again, this sort of big blob of individuals who all were speaking and thinking in lockstep, and now it's being thrown back in their faces and they don't like it.
Claire, what was happening? I mean, the people to whom this was happening, you would regard as amongst the most vulnerable in any of our communities. And what the treatment that seemed to be meted out to them is beyond neglect, to the point where it just seems cruel. What are we looking at here in terms of the testimony as described?
So I look at it broadly as falling into two camps. So on the one hand, we had people who were given do not resuscitate orders. And the reality is that most resuscitation is not successful. And when it is successful, you often need intensive care support. But that happened at the same time as hospitals were denying admission to anybody that had a do not resuscitate order. So it wasn't that it was do not resuscitate, it became do not give any medical care to these people. So that was one catastrophe. And then the other side of it was what was happening with end-of-life medication, whereby people who, we had the protocols that were binary in terms of what could happen if somebody deteriorated. And if they weren't going to be actively treated and put on ventilators, then they were to be given end-of-life medication. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody in a care home with COVID ended up on end-of-life medication. And there would have been some for whom that would have been appropriate because they were going to die. But it seems that there is a bigger middle portion here than I had appreciated at first, because there are so many people who've been telling stories about their loved ones who under other circumstances would have been treated very differently, and who, for lack of visitors, which was a big deal, did not have the support and care they normally would have had, and were being given these drugs, which are very powerful and dangerous, and which palliative care experts were calling out in May 2020, because these protocols were very explicit about how you accelerated the drug, but said nothing about winding it down. And these drugs suppress the respiratory drive. So where they have a great usage in end-of-life care when you've got cancer, it's a different story when you've got an acute respiratory infection, and the drive to breathe is incredibly important in terms of survival.
Yeah, so you got... Sorry,
I'm just thinking, so essentially you're saying that really quite large cohorts of people were being murdered. I mean, honestly, that's the way it sounds to me.
So I think that's really, really difficult term to be using.
Yeah, sorry.
And I don't think that the people who were giving out these medications had any ill intent. I genuinely don't think there was any ill intent in what they were doing. It was how these decisions were being made is the problem. So first of all, you've got people the doctors were giving out these prescriptions beforehand, getting people already ready for lockdown, and then were very much practicing at a distance at the other end of a phone. And so people who were making the decisions about the likelihood of living or dying did not necessarily have the expertise to be doing that.
That really begins to touch on what frightens me about what happened. It was the fact that these places, a lot of these care homes became places in which the elderly were lost and isolated. The normal engagements with the family, who have the best interests of those people closest to their hearts, were left out of the equation. And that these people, often with dementia, often in a very precarious health position, were isolated in every way that mattered.
Absolutely. And when I first heard these stories, I will admit to being very sceptical about it, because as a doctor, what I've experienced is that when somebody dies, you often have sort of two types of relative. You have the ones that have been at the bedside and who've heard all of the details and have followed the story in depth, who understand what happened. And then you have the sort of relatives at a distance, however far that may have been, who very often don't quite get it and feel, aggrieved about the process and want to blame. And so when I first heard these stories, I thought that this was because of mass communication breakdown, because of what we had done. If you remove the relatives from a dying situation, you're going to create that problem. But having heard all these testimonies where the story's the same, again and again and again, it becomes, I just think I was wrong on that. I don't think it was a communication problem. I think there was more to it than that. There was more going on there.
And Jasmine, it felt like yet another example of why locking down in the way that was forced upon us. It's another example of the way in which that was disastrous.
Every way. Honestly, I cannot think of a really good reason to lock down anybody, any of us, whatever cohort. And particularly in this case, where we had so many stories, and even I've seen videos of people, at the window of the care homes trying to touch each other, and they can't, and physically held away from each other. How is that good in any way for people who are trying to get better? It's like we now realise it's a good idea to bring dogs and cats, pets in to help people. The very least that you could do is to help people by having them very close to their loved ones. That's very often what makes them better. Forget about the drugs and everything.
Jasmine and Claire are going to stay with me. We're going into a break, but after that we'll all still be together, and I'll be joined by one of the witnesses who testified during the Scottish COVID-19 inquiry, and she'll tell us what happened to her brother during the pandemic. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest lost her brother, James, a father of two, aged just 41, during the pandemic. The reason for his death was given as COVID-19. She has given evidence at the Scottish COVID-19 inquiry. Before I introduce her, just get this sense of the atmosphere of the testimony of the inquiry. Here's a short clip.
The inquiry must investigate whether the right to life under Article 2 was respected and protected. We anticipate the inquiry will hear that people were pressured to agree to do not resuscitate notices, that people were not resuscitated even though no such notice was in place, that residents may have been neglected and left to starve, that families are not sure they were told the truth about their relative's cause of death, that the usual process for certification of deaths was departed from. The inquiry must investigate potential violations of Article 3, the prohibition on torture, inhuman and degrading treatment.
Pamela Thomas joins me now down the line. Hello, Pamela. Thanks for joining me this evening.
Hi, Neil. Thanks for having me on.
Can you give us a sense of, what happened to your brother and, the testimony that you gave to the inquiry?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've watched the inquiry or not, the evidence that I gave, but everything that's kind of coming out at the inquiry has been quite damning, and there's not a single person reporting on our testimonies, the things that we've went through as a families, the way we've had to suffer, the way we've been stonewalled, the lies, the cover-ups have been non-stop since day one.
Tell me what you saw happening to your brother.
My brother was basically locked away from us. My brother was 6 days before I was allowed to have a WhatsApp video call with him. And by that time he was placed on a ventilator and he was unconscious, so wasn't able to communicate with me. I was only able to communicate with him, speak to him and see him via a phone screen. It was absolutely horrific. Every single day, the phone calls, I would phone first thing in the morning, the doctors would do their rounds, they would phone me back in the afternoon, I would phone again, do a video call roughly around about tea time, between tea time and 7:30, and then a call again before I went to my bed each night, so it was roughly 4 times a day, and every single time I was basically being told the same thing. Every single time on the phone calls I was being asked if I had been vaccinated, if anyone else had been vaccinated in my family. If we hadn't been, then we should be. And all along I was told that my brother had a single organ failure. It was his COVID lungs. It was only his lungs that was a problem with my brother, which was basically lies.
What did James go into hospital with? What were his symptoms that prompted him to seek treatment at all?
So it was dehydration and diarrhoea. So we were under the impression that he would have some fluids and, he would be home in no time. But a few hours after him being admitted into hospital, we were told that he was going to die. He was going to die within a matter of 2 hours. We were told that he was going to die. I can still remember to this day the screaming. How can he be going to die? How is he going to die?
What has been, Pamela, the atmosphere in the inquiry? Have you felt that your testimony and the testimony of other people who have related stories to tell, in what way is your testimony being received there?
Well, it was fantastic to get the opportunity to give the evidence and say, although there was issues around being able to say my brother's name, for instance, that had to be all sorted out on the first day of the inquiry. We weren't even allowed to say the name of our loved ones. Eventually we were allowed to, but we weren't allowed to name the hospitals or any of the doctors or nurses or anybody that was involved in their care. We were restricted from doing that. But we got the chance to give our evidence, and obviously by being able to do that, that's what's got me here today. And obviously I've had other kind of podcasts and things like that.
We approached the NHS Trust for comment. They said, while we cannot comment on matters relating to individual patients due to patient confidentiality, our thoughts remain with Mr. Cameron's family. Our clinicians have responded in great detail on 2 occasions to the concerns raised by the family. We have already invited the family to raise any outstanding concerns with us, and this offer remains.
Pamela Thomas, thank you so much. My heart goes out to you on account of everything that you've gone through, the loss of your brother, what it must have been like for your family, but thank you so much for taking the time to bring that to light this evening.
Okay, thanks for having me on. Take care.
Now we're going into a break, after which we'll be considering another plight, the plight of Julian Assange. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. On Monday, there will be a final judgment in the High Court regarding the appeal by Australian-born publisher Julian Assange against extradition to the United States. With that in mind, he faces 18 criminal charges, and it's going to be a matter of what the court finally decides. Joining me to discuss this is Chairman of Republicans Overseas, Greg Swenson, and also Editor-in-Chief of WikiLeaks, Kristen Hrafnsson. Kristen, thanks for making time for us this evening. What do we predict is going to happen on Monday?
Well, if I were to predict a logical and rational and just outcome, it would be that Julian would be granted leave to appeal. He was granted provisional leave to appeal on one ground. All the other grounds, which were very impressive, were dismissed, and some of those were just dismissed on absolutely incredible twisted logic. We can come into that later. But he was granted this leave to appeal because it seemed that he would not be granted First Amendment protection as a publisher and a journalist in the United States. However, the United States government was asked to clarify that. So they were asked a simple question: will Julian Assange be able to rely on the First Amendment in a U.S. courtroom? The United States government has come back in written form and said he can seek to rely on the First Amendment. Now, that's a no answer in anybody's book. So they haven't fulfilled what the request that the court said. So the logical outcome would be that on Monday, and it shouldn't take long, the judges will say, you haven't met the points that we set, and he will get a leave to appeal. However, we've seen a lot of very strange and spurious things in the courts here. So I have to admit that I take a cynical approach to that.
What is Julian Assange's mood at the moment? I mean, it's almost an impossible question to answer, I know, but after all of this time, year after year after year, where is he now?
Well, he's been in Belmarsh prison now for more than 5 years. Mentally, you can imagine what an effect it has to be an innocent man locked up for more than 5 years in a limbo. Before that, he spent 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy as an asylee. Before that, he was under house arrest for 2 years. So it's 14 years of being deprived of liberty in one form or another. Of course, he's been under an extreme duress, and it's stressful. He has suffered, and I cannot go into personal detail. I visit him regularly, but it's a matter for the court, and the records have been sent to the courts, which say basically that he is in grave danger.
Greg, looking on at this, I can only give my opinion on this. It seems unbelievable to me that a publisher in the 21st century has been treated in this way and continues to be in extremis in the way that Julian Assange is.
Yeah, it's pretty outrageous, and I think I'm one of the converted on this. When it first happened, a decade ago, everybody just kind of jumped to the conclusion, and they threw him in the same basket as Bradley Manning, which I thought, in retrospect, was a mistake. So, Julian was a publisher, or is a publisher, and he published something. That's different than stealing. He didn't steal anything. Bradley Manning stole something. He went to the penitentiary, and for 7 years, as it turns out, because he was found guilty of Espionage Act, amongst many other things. So I think you have to really separate the two. And so, over the years, by paying more attention to the detail, that's one reason I've flipped on this. But the second reason is what's happened in the last 5 or so years in the US and the UK in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It's outrageous what's happened. And the list of examples, starting with the Hunter Biden laptop and the Russia collusion hoax, and whether it's media companies purposely censoring themselves for the benefit of one view that they have, or the government actually getting involved with the censorship. We saw that here with the 77th Brigade. We saw it constantly with the Biden White House working with Facebook, working with other media companies on the censorship, mostly during the COVID years. That's probably the most obvious. But that's really changed perceptions of, conservatives like myself, who always kind of jump to the first conclusion of, anti-American, let's put him in jail. It's just a natural impulse when you see, American or British soldiers at risk, which you can kind of attach to that. But that's not on Julian. I might not agree with, I would have preferred he didn't publish it, but that doesn't mean he should be in jail for publishing it.
Kristen, what are the ramifications for the role of publisher, for the role of people who seek to bring truthful, accurate information to the public? What does this fiasco do to the future of publishing in the West?
it is one of the most gravest threats to the future of journalism if this goes ahead. So, and every major human rights and free speech organizations in the world now agree with that, and they are pointing to the very severe implication this could have. The precedent being set, and it could be argued that it had already had a very serious cooling effect on the media, which has hurt the press freedom worldwide. It just goes without saying. I mean, if the American government is allowed to have universal jurisdiction and as in this case, demand an extradition of an Australian publisher who is publishing in Europe and never comes close to the United States, and hand him over and throw him into jail there. Not a single journalist anywhere is safe in the world.
And to me, the most glaring part of this is that he's hardly alone in having published what he published.
Absolutely. I mean, he was publishing in coordination with one of the biggest powerhouses in the mainstream media environment, with the New York Times, the Spiegel, the Guardian, and actually under Obama, the Justice Department under Eric Holder did look into the matter whether they should open a prosecution against Julian, and they came to the conclusion that would be just too much a danger to the First Amendment principle. They actually called it the New York Times problem, because there was no distinction being made between what Julian did and what the New York Times, our collaborators, our media co-workers in the project were doing.
Greg, surely this is a situation from which the US administration must extract itself.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, for the American government, the U.S. government, to be involved in this kind of censorship or the threat to publishers, not just
the threat to a publisher's life.
It's it's really done great damage, and I think we've seen, and I agree with you, Kristen. We've seen the results of this, right? And now I can't pin this particular incident on the lack of interest from the media. Maybe that's just because they become biased or disagree with with the people in the mainstream. But this is not a good moment for it, and I'm glad that there's a good chance that he won't be extradited. So,
well, let's hope so.
Yeah.
That has to be all from me this week on TV, but this conversation will be continuing online. We'll be continuing to chat, so please go online to the Neil Oliver Show on gbnews.com. But in the meantime, I'll see you next week, TV viewers. In the first hour, we had part of a conversation regarding the endless predicament of Julian Assange. I'm joined in the studio by Greg Swenson from Republicans Overseas UK and also Editor-in-Chief of WikiLeaks, Kristen Hrafnsson. Thanks for staying with me. Kristen, what might the future hold for Julian Assange if and when this saga finally comes to an end?
Well, are you saying that if he's freed?
If he's freed, if he gets his life back.
If he gets his life back, I mean, it will be a long time of recovery, as you can imagine. I mean, he has not been able to walk on green grass for 14 years. So, I mean, it will take a long time for him to recover, I assume, and I hope that he does. But he is an intellectual, and he has many ideas. I hope that he could be a very valuable in give us input into the current discourse, because, as Greg was pointing out, we're on a slippery slope here when it comes to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and we need to gather together and actually reevaluate our position on this and take these rights back that have been eroded and lost over the years.
Greg, is there any appetite remaining in the US, in any sense, for the extradition?
A lot less. And it's interesting because it used to be a left-right thing. And Julian has now got a huge number of fans on the right. And again, it goes to the censorship that's occurred in the last 5 or 6 years. It's really troubling to many Americans. So people are ignoring their traditional left-right views and looking at this as, a core freedom of speech. And again, emphasizing that WikiLeaks is a publisher, and we need publishers, and they should be doing all these media organizations should be holding governments accountable. And why would we threaten that? And that's what would happen if Julian is tried and convicted.
I do get the feeling that the Democrats in power at the moment, that they are feeling very edgy, that they're actually being shown or look like the baddies, and they don't want to look like the bad guys here. So they've got a bit of a tussle with themselves. They want to look like they're good, but at the same time they don't want to seem to be weak, I think, as well. But I think that the not wanting to be the bad guys is going to win over in their decision making.
Possibly.
Kristen, the extent to which it feels like the 2020 election in the US was influenced by, as Greg mentioned, the way in which relevant, important information was suppressed. You coupled with this ongoing tormenting of Julian Assange, how does the US get back to a position of being a defender of the First Amendment, of freedom of speech, of the sanctity of the press? It feels like it has crossed the Rubicon, never to return.
Unfortunately, yes, and I'm very saddened by that. I mean, I used to be a great admirer of, the First Amendment principle. I used to be working for the mainstream media as a correspondent in New York City, and I'm quite fond of the country. There is not an anti-American sentiment within WikiLeaks, I can assure you, and that has never been the case when it comes to Julian Assange per se. So there is a lot to admire there. I don't know how they can get it back, but the damage is huge, and it's been I've been very saddened to watch and observe these big powerhouses in the media actually lose their footing, and it's sad. When it comes to Julian Assange's case, it has undermined the credibility and the soft power that the United States has across the globe. They cannot, with any credibility, lecture other nations on press freedom. And the leaders in less so democratic countries have actually pointed that out. Aliyev in Azerbaijan basically quit at the BBC journalist who was criticizing him about press freedom in Azerbaijan, which is severely lacking. And he basically came back, how can you lecture me when you have Julian Assange in prison in London? The same thing we've heard from Russia and China. So that's a damage that's already done, and that's sad. You've given those oppressive nations where press freedom is severely lacking ammunition to actually increase the suppression of freedom of the press in their own countries. That's it. I have no idea how the Americans can walk back and actually regain this, but I hope they will at one point. But the instrumental in that point and a turning point in that effect is dropping the case against Julian Assange. As President Biden has said recently that he is considering, that should be an easy thing to conclude and just let him go. And we can stop this process of extradition. This is the best solution, a political decision, because the only way to reverse a political decision, as the one under Trump, where his Department of Justice launched his attack on Julian, is to take a political decision to unwind it and say, this is enough, let's end this.
Greg, such an impossibly difficult political situation to handle, isn't it?
Yeah.
How does any administration extricate itself from this?
It's difficult.
Without it looking disastrous one way or another.
Yeah, I think in some ways they could just sort of kick it to the side. And it's the more they pursue this, the bigger the deal becomes. Yeah. And I think that's the mistake. So they have to look at, this binary choice. If they continue with it, it doesn't matter which party, they're going to be the party of censorship. And nobody wants that.
And Jasmine, you and I consider us to be just the regular people, the observers. Yeah. You and I, we grew up with America as the good guys.
Yep. Exactly, and ourselves as the good guys. And are we now? No, we're not. America isn't, Britain isn't, Europe isn't. The West increasingly is the bad guys. And I was actually, like you, originally I was against I was against Julian Assange, but over the last 4 years at least, I've changed my view, like you, I think particularly because I've changed my view about the establishment, about our government, about the media, of which I am a member, and the way that we have been continuously lied to, and the surveillance and the cancellation of people, of anybody who has an alternative view, and particularly if that view happens to be truthful, and that has all enabled me, and I think millions of others, to go, actually, I'm not only do I trust this guy now, but I want to fight for him, and I will continue to fight for him.
Kristen, last question to you. If America has dropped the ball on being the good guys, certainly when it comes to freedom of speech, surely that ball is there to be picked up by someone else. There's an opening there for someone else to establish that reputation for upholding the basics of freedom of speech.
Well, if you go to the list of the organizations that are fighting for Julian Assange now, you have every major organization which are on that battlefront, whether it's Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, the Reporters Without Borders, and the list goes on. I mean, there are 3 or 4 dozens of all major organizations. So everybody is screaming for this to happen, and for this. I was in Chile just a week ago at the UNESCO event celebrating Press Freedom Day, and the state of journalism worldwide is very serious, and it is spiraling down. And what Julian Assange's case has contributed to that we don't simply know, but I am afraid that has set up a precedent that has already had a negative effect, and we need to take that back, and people need to realize how hurtful this is to democracy. And because we're sitting in our studio here in London, I need to point out that this case has damaged the institution in this country. The court has been damaged because it's become blatantly obvious that the process is politicized. That's obvious. My favorite example, if I have time to just mention it, is that the Royal Court of Justice denied Julian the right to appeal on the point, which was that you could not extradite somebody to a country whose Secret Service has drawn up plots to kidnap and assassinate him, as we have now documented and unrefuted. It should be obvious. You wouldn't do that with China or Russia or any other country if you had that established. You cannot extradite somebody to such a country. Well, the court said, and I'm a little bit paraphrasing, but only a little bit. The court said, well, those plots, they don't refute that it's true. They were drawn up by the CIA in 2017 and had nothing to do with this extradition process. And the plot to kidnap or assassinate Julian Assange in London will be useless anyway if he's legally extradited. Then you don't have to kidnap and assassinate him in London. Thereby, you cannot appeal on that point. It's
astonishing stuff. Thank you so much. The parlous state of journalism could hardly have been laid barer than what we've heard this evening. Kristen Hrafnsson, Greg Swenson, Jasmine Birtles, thank you so much for that debate. Going into a break, coming up, we'll be chatting to Iranian-American academic and political analyst Mohammad Marandi about the situation in the Middle East. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. The situation in Gaza, week after week, month after month, becomes simply harder and harder to look at. But look at it we must. And I try to imagine what it must be like actually to be physically on the ground there. All of it is so unthinkable. There's an unfolding offensive in Rafah, of course. You have to wonder how many more people will join the grim death toll. And perhaps most important of all, what will it take to bring peace, to bring that horror to an end? I'm joined now to contemplate some or all of that by Iranian-American academic and political analyst Syed Mohammad Marandi. Thank you so much for joining us, Syed.
Thank you for having me.
very difficult to watch day after day, week after week, month after month. What is your understanding of the situation on the ground as we speak, if that's possible, please?
The situation is horrific. Food does not get into Gaza adequately. This is systematic, and starvation is being imposed on the people of Gaza. A lot of Western countries, when the South African complaint to the ICJ got a positive result, they immediately accepted an Israeli accusation about the UN body that gives aid to the Palestinians, and they withdrew their financial support. And that was seen by people across the region as an attempt by Western countries to assist the Israeli regime in this starvation to get concessions from the Palestinian people. While the starvation is taking place and while children are dying, and these children, by the way, who die are not going to be on any list, or the people who die of disease, they're not going to be on any lists of casualties. They're just going to be considered as ordinary dead Palestinians. They're not the ones who are bombed or who get killed because of shrapnel wounds or drone strikes. So the real number of the deaths in Gaza are much higher than the official count. And of course, many thousands of people are missing they're under the rubble, and they have not been included in the death toll either.
It feels, Syed, as though really for one of the first times that I can remember that in one city after another, one country after another around the world, the feeling seems overwhelmingly that just a desperation for this horror show to end. It feels very different. And is that attitude in one country after another having any kind of an effect? Is it tipping a balance away from bloodshed at all?
No, it's not changing the situation on the ground. The Israelis continue to bomb Gazans day and night. Snipers are killing random Palestinians walking in the streets, and starvation continues. What effect it is having is that it is marginalizing the West. I was listening to your previous guest talking about Julian Assange and how this has influenced Western soft power across the world. This is even, I think, far more damaging to the United States, to the UK, to Western countries in general, because across the world, people are looking with horror at what's going on.
Yeah,
people across the world have a good understanding of the history of Gaza too, probably better than many in the West, but because Israel has so much influence. And this is going to have a long-term impact on how the world perceives Western governments.
Syed, bear with me while I also involve my guest in the studio, Jasmine Birtles. Jasmine, it does feel different, doesn't it?
Yes.
You know, what's happening in Gaza is horrifying the world, is it not?
Well, it is. And, you know, I'm thinking about, as Syed said, that you've got governments or heads of government who seem to be supporting the Israeli side, but the vast majority, I would say, of the electorate, and what I would really describe as the proper establishment, you've got the academia, really media on the whole, certainly, you know, the rank and file of journalists and, you know, a lot of other people, as you say, they are horrified at what's happening, and they are more on the side, I would say, of Palestinians. So it has changed, and it does feel like a sea change, certainly in the West, and I would say across the globe. So this whole war is doing, I think, Israel, more, you know, morally more damage than Palestine, it seems to me.
There is a shift. There is a shift, surely, Syed, in the peoples of the West. As Jasmine says, the leaders may be saying one thing, but the peoples of the West demonstrably want an end of this and are thinking less and less of Israel and of their own leadership with every day that this goes on.
Yes, and I think that has a lot to do with social media. Even though social media is censored, I've been removed from Facebook. I've been removed from Instagram, and so have many others. But the images are so horrific that it's having a huge impact. But there is a reason to have optimism despite all the horrors, and that is that many young people, as your guest in the studio was alluding to, perhaps indirectly, young people in particular, I would say, have shifted. And you see this among many young Jews, Christians and Muslims and Hindus, especially in the United States. We see that many of the anti-genocide protests that are being held on campuses are being led by young Jewish students. We have people across the world seeing this. And I think that what I think is really a fact is that the Israeli regime, through its actions, is creating anti-Semitism. And those Jewish protesters who are protesting against the regime, they're the ones who are destroying the narrative of anti-Semitism.
Although I think, you say, as has been well demonstrated in protests in London or in the UK, Jewish people, Jewish young people in particular, I would say, taking part in the protests. I think there is a burgeoning sense, or it would appear as a burgeoning sense, that it's against the regime. It's the political regime of Israel, Zionist Israel, that has fallen foul of public opinion. I think there's still a very strong sense around the world that this is not to do with Jewishness, that it's political and ideological. That understanding is there, which surely must count for something also.
Absolutely, and that has not gone unnoticed across the world. It has not gone unnoticed in this country, in Iran, or anywhere else in the region. We see some of the best journalism that's being, the material being produced by them are young Jews, like in the gray zone in the United States. Some of the very good work there produced by Max Blumenthal, for example, he's a Jew, or Aaron Maté, a Jew. And there are many other young Jews and older Jews. Norman Finkelstein, a very important scholar, Jewish, and I think people recognize that there is a clear separation between Judaism and Zionism. And of course, Zionists are not just Jews. Perhaps there are more non-Jewish Zionists in the United States than there are Jewish Zionists. So it has absolutely nothing to do with this. This genocide is being supported by governments that are secular. So, this is a humanitarian issue. This is an issue of grave injustice. And the more this continues, the longer this lasts, the worse it is going to be for the Israeli regime. But it's also going to get worse for Western governments, because people across the world, when they see the West accuse other countries of human rights violations, of aggression, and then they see the degree to which they support what's going on in Gaza, they're going to tilt away from the West further than before. And I think each day that this goes by, it's only going to get worse.
What about, though, the issue of Hamas itself? Because, I think I'm fairly typical of many people in this country who support the Palestinian people, but we're very unhappy about Hamas itself. I mean, I understand how they are created, and, more will be being created right now, I do know. But they are wanting to just destroy all, the whole Israeli state, all Jews. They said death to all Jews. They are apparently embedding themselves with the ordinary people. This is unacceptable, So how can we deal, if you like, with the Hamas issue?
Well, Hamas does not say that all Jews should be killed, and Hamas has been speaking about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But the whole point, the broader picture that Hamas and others in this region have been talking about is that Zionism is the great injustice. and that Muslims cannot be, or Christians cannot be, treated as subhumans in Palestine. It's like the Warsaw Ghetto. Hamas will lash out just as as Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto lashed out, or the French Resistance, or during apartheid South Africa. When during apartheid South Africa, the ANC had a military wing. They were considered to be terrorists. The U.S. government by law stated Nelson and Mandela to be a terrorist. In fact, he continued to remain a terrorist according to U.S. law until 2009, well after he retired from politics. He was president and a terrorist, and he left office, and he was still a terrorist according to U.S. law. So the issue is not Hamas. The issue is not Islamic Jihad. The issue is not any other group. The issue is that Palestine, this land, from the river to the sea, is a place where all these people have to be equal human beings. They all have to be able to live together as citizens. And this is not, rocket science. This is something that has happened in South Africa. South Africa, when it was dismantled, it has many problems. I've been to South Africa. But white South Africans and black South Africans continue to live together. They continue to work in parliament, and they continue to work in government.
Going to have to jump in there. Syed Marandi, thank you so much for that. Equal people sharing a state. What an optimistic thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. To further develop this conversation, I'd like to speak now to Aurelie Tobelem, who's the president of the Israel Society at King's College London. Aurelie, I'm sure you were listening to what my previous guest had to say. What is the end game for Israel in this situation? At what point will it have reached its objective?
Thank you for having me on, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here. I must say that I'm not here as a representative of the Israeli government, so I cannot always speak to the real-time objectives of the State of Israel. However, from a statement of April 9th by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the objectives of the Israeli state in the Israel-Hamas war remain predominantly the same as they were on October 7th, which is, number one, to rescue the hostages who are currently held in Hamas captivity in Gaza, to eliminate Hamas, and to ensure that what happened on October 7th can never happen again. That seems to be the end game of the Gaza war. It was described by you earlier, I believe, as a horror show. I share that view, but for different reasons to you. It seems to me that there's an extremely worrying development that has taken the world by force, which is that in the arena of anti-Israel discourse, the mere assertion suffices. Generalized accusations against Israel are always taken to be true because it is always assumed that Israel has done what it is accused of doing. Now, Dr. Marandi, the esteemed Dr. Marandi, leveled the genocide charge multiple times. Now, suppose we accept even the most inflated and highly disputed Hamas figures of 33,774 as reported by Al Jazeera, and include the 12,000 Hamas fighters who are claimed to have been killed by the IDF. If we consider that Gaza has a population of 2.3 million, this gives us an approximate death toll of 1.5%. Let's compare this with the Rwandan genocide, in which 800,000 Tutsis, approximately 84% of the Tutsi population in Rwanda at the time, were killed by Houthi militias. Now, this is not only my observation or my argument. These are actually shared by the former president of the International Court of Justice, Joan Donoghue, who on April 26th in an interview with the BBC clarified quite clearly that the court did not decide on whether the claim of genocide was plausible in South Africa's case. So the accusation of genocide is taken to be true. It is shouted from the rooftops by the so-called brave warriors of the watermelon resistance on the streets of London, Malmö, Marseille, and elsewhere. but it fails to actually provide a factual basis for its own claim.
What about, though, surely the undeniable fact that the strength of the feeling of people in cities and in countries around the world that wants to see this stopping now? You know, you're talking about the objective being the destruction of Hamas, which would then raise the notion of whether it's possible to, in any way, to do, you know, using military might to destroy an ideology or an idea. What about the fact, though, that public opinion is strongly, and with young Jewish people and older Jewish people strongly represented in these protests, the peoples of the world, not the governments, not the leaders, but the peoples of the world seem to strongly want what's happening in Gaza to stop?
Well, Neil, I'm very glad that you've said that, because the peoples of the world are often and tragically misled by propaganda, which is generated by Hamas and sponsored by the Islamic regime in Iran, as well as the state of Qatar. Now, I cannot speak to what my fellow Jews are doing at these protests, but I can tell you that according to a recent poll by Campaign Against Anti-Semitism in the UK, more than 80% of British Jews identify themselves as Zionist, and less than 5% identify themselves as anti-Zionist. So when you talk about the overwhelming number of Jews and young Jews who are protesting against Israel, I don't particularly know what you're talking about. When it comes to protests within Israel, that's where things are different. We have many anti-war protests in Israel, people who want the hostages to be rescued, who want them to be returned to their homes where they rightfully belong and where they were taken by Hamas on October 7th.
I mean, you say that you've got social media that's paid for by Muslim, by Qatar, etc. Well, we definitely know that the Israeli state has been funding a huge amount of pro-Israeli social media. I mean, I know people who've been approached, who are social media influencers, who've been approached to promote the Israeli side. So I really don't think that, you know, you can say that this is a one-sided thing. And it's true, yes, that there are Zionist Jews in this country, but I think there's a growing number of Jews who are saying this is wrong. We want the whole thing.
Just in the interest of shortage of time, Aurel, can I just a quick response there before I'll just have to bring this conversation to a close, only because of shortage of time. A quick response.
I think you'll see that given the success of the Eurovision Song Contest, public support is overwhelmingly for Israel and Israeli performers. The British public gave its votes majority to Israel. The German public gave the majority of its votes to Israel. And the Republic of Ireland gave a large majority of its votes to Israel. So I think if you're looking for public support, you have it.
Aurel Tobalem, thank you so much for a very measured contribution to an important conversation. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Coming up, political comedian and podcast host Jimmy Dore joins me next. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, I will make absolutely no bones about the fact that my final guest this evening is someone I've invited along simply because I am a huge fan of his work. American comedian and now podcast host Jimmy Dore. Now, in the old world, in the world of before, he was a left-leaning comedian, I'm sure he won't mind me saying. But then the last 4 years happened. The COVID debacle, which plucked so many of us up from where we were and dropped us down in a new location. You could say we are all a long way from Kansas. Good evening to you, dear friend Jimmy Dore.
It's great to see you. Thanks for having me on.
As I say, like so many of us, your life was different once, and then the recent events intervened. I wonder if you could, just for my audience, kind of give us a summary of what happened to you and why you find yourself where you are with the opinions that you hold now.
Well, I was considered a progressive. I supported Bernie Sanders in 2016. And then I saw the Democratic Party cheat him outright, and no one ever paid a price for that, and nothing got changed. And then Donald Trump won that election, and the entire establishment and the media, corporate media in the United States and the Democratic Party, along with the FBI and the CIA, concocted a conspiracy theory that was the dumbest conspiracy theory I've ever seen, was called Russiagate. And that's been debunked many times over by their own investigations. And still people believe it. And so when I saw them pull off a hoax like that, it was kind of shocking to me. And then I saw the lies they told about the gas attacks in Syria. I started to look into what happened in Libya, which was the same thing that happened in Iraq. And it turns out that the United States and NATO are the terrorists. And then COVID happened. And I couldn't believe it, right? So when I took the Moderna vaccine, I got vaccine injured. People told me to shut up about it, not talk about it. When I looked into it, I found out we were being lied to about everything. They lied to us about where the virus came from. And if you said it came from a lab, you were a white supremacist. They lied about funding it. Now the NIH admits they funded that. Dr. Fauci lied twice to Congress about funding that. They lied about masks. They lied about herd immunity. They lied about natural immunity. They lied about transmission. They lied about contraction. There wasn't a thing they didn't lie about. And the thing is, that's why they told you, please don't do your own research. Because if you did, you'd find out that this was a big scam and everybody was lying to you about it from start to finish. The average age of death from COVID in the United States, 82 years old. The average life expectancy in the United States is 77. So if you get COVID, you get 5 more years. That's what it looks like to me. So there wasn't a thing they didn't lie about. So that's changed me from being I'm not a Democrat anymore, that's for sure, because I see, and what's going on with the prosecution of Donald Trump is that the Democrats and Republicans serve the same donor base. They serve the same billionaire-controlled establishment. And I've tried to make that point to lots of people on my show, and a lot of people get it, that if you go against the establishment or the war machine even a little bit, that's what they'll do to you. They'll criminalize you. So you have to remember the election of Donald Trump and Brexit happened at the same time. And so the people who are in the United States now say that democracy is on the ballot. That's the thing they actually hate and fear.
Jimmy,
people. Go ahead.
Jimmy, I've said, actually, it was my wife that first coined the thought for me. She said that because Donald Trump was elected and the people of Britain voted to leave the European Union, that everything that happened thereafter was a sustained punishment beating to put the people back in their box on both sides of the Atlantic. What do you make of that?
She's 100% correct. That's exactly what happened. They can't have that happen again. And so that's everything that's been going on has been a beat. Of course, they all do it in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom and liberty. And, you try to figure out, why does the establishment in both parties in the United States, why do they both hate Donald Trump? Because they loved him my whole life. He was on every television show. They gave him his own TV show for 10 years. They gave him Emmy nominations. They all golf together. Their kids are all best friends. They all go to each other's 3rd and 4th weddings together. So why did they all of a sudden turn on Donald Trump? And my theory is that is because he tells an inconvenient truth every once in a while, because he's such a political novice. And the example I give is when they asked him, why are you leaving troops in Syria? And he said, for the oil. It's our oil and we're taking it. And they can't have that. He's supposed to say it's for liberty and democracy and freedom. He's not supposed to give the game away. So the whole world saw the president of the United States look into a camera and say that our foreign policy for the last 60 years have been based on invading smaller, weaker countries and stealing their natural resources and giving it to Western corporations. And so that's my theory on why they hate him and why they have to get rid of him. And they've already painted him as a white supremacist and a racist. So it's hard to do imperialism when the face of it is a guy you said is a racist. So that's another reason why they have to get rid of him. But your wife is exactly right. They don't want democracy. And this has been a punishment. Everything they've been doing has been a punishment for that.
Jimmy Dore, bear with me. My guest in the studio this evening, Jasmine Birtle, is also a supporter of your work. Yeah. Jasmine, you were nodding along and making agreeable noises to everything that Jimmy was saying there.
Yeah, I've subscribed to your YouTube channel, and I was thinking, Jimmy, that you and Naomi Wolf and a few other people have moved really 180 degrees, it sounds to me, from Democrat voting. I mean, as you say, not sure what to. There are not many choices. But have you found that you've lost friends? Have a lot of people turned against you because you're now speaking against what you used to speak for?
Yes, it started when I wouldn't vote for warmongering enemy of the worker Hillary Clinton, and then it just got worse from there. You know, I debunked Russiagate. I was the first one. I brought on Bill Binney, who was the top code breaker for the NSA, and he proved conclusively that it wasn't the Russians that hacked into the DNC server, and so I knew that was a scam from the beginning. When I also debunked the gas attacks in Syria, and then when I went on to tell the truth about Ukraine, that's another thing they won't do in the United States. Mm-hmm. Jon Stewart won't tell you the truth. Jon Stewart literally hung a medal on a Nazi in Disney World, but he won't tell you about vaccines. He won't tell you. He had a vaccine panel. He brought on 4 vaccine establishment liars. He didn't bring on Dr. Robert Malone or Peter McCullough or Dr. Pierre Corey. He didn't bring on a counter narrative. He didn't bring on even me, a comedian. So that's why he has a show. That's why he's allowed for the last 25 years on network television, because he does the bidding of the establishment, exactly as Chris had just said on my show. So I've lost lots of friends. I'm radioactive when it comes to representation in Hollywood, but that doesn't matter because I've gone around them. They're just gatekeepers, and now because of Rumble and because of YouTube and Twitter, I go right past those people and I go right to the people, and so now I go all over the world, and I feel theaters are sold out. I just did a European tour. I was in Stockholm, I was in Oslo, I was in Copenhagen, I was in London, I was in Berlin, and sold out everywhere. People are hungry for the truth. They're tired of the billionaire-owned Western media, and so I'm glad to bring the truth to them. You know, people have been so gaslit. They're so, Noam Chomsky taught us that what the corporate media is there to do is to make you feel like no one else is thinking the things you're thinking, that you're the only one thinking that. When I come on and I tell them, no, there's lots of people that are thinking the exact same thing, and you're not crazy. That's the number one thing people tell me when I meet them, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the United States or Canada. I was just in Canada for a weekend. They come up to me and they shake my hand. They look me in the eye with tears in their eye, and they say, thanks for keeping me sane.
Which is what Neil gets. Neil gets this all the time.
Jimmy, I sometimes think, that if I could press a button and make the COVID, I just use that as a summarising word, never have happened. I sometimes think maybe I would press the button and make it all not happen. But then, to be quite honest with you, what I have learned in the last few years and the relationships that have fallen away from me, the new relationships that I have forged, all taken together, I am absolutely certain that I had to go through this, and that I have become a much more reasoned and questioning and aware person because of what has happened. And it sounds like you're in a similar place.
Well, certainly the thing that was the most heartbreaking for me was I was always proud to be a comedian and part of the comedy brotherhood, because comedians always question authority. They never do what you told them to do something, they do the exact opposite. And then it was the most bizarre thing during COVID. I saw comedian after comedian that I respected would go on stage and shame people for trying to get informed about an experimental medical treatment that they're supposed to take. They would tell people, please don't do your own research, which before COVID, doing your own research just meant you were reading. And so that's how powerful Big Pharma's propaganda is. It got comedians to shame people for reading. You wouldn't shame people for any other topic, no matter how trivial. It's like, hey, I'm going to go buy a car. Don't look into it. Well, how will I know what car to buy? You should ask the salesman. He's the expert. Who are you, Henry Ford? That's what comedians basically, and so it broke my heart. I lost a lot of comedy friends, but I made a lot of new friends, and those people are salt of the earth, and it really warms my heart. The thing I like to do when I go out touring, I love doing the shows, but the thing I like even more is meeting the people before and after the shows and hearing their story. And it's really heartwarming, and it's good to know that people like you and me provide a service that people are desperately in need of.
You've touched on Ukraine already. You made me think there. For me, amongst many utterly unbelievable moments that seemed to sum something up in the last few years was when a bona fide SS Nazi was given a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament. Was congratulated for having fought Russia in World War II. And I thought, that's going to be hard to top. That's a special moment. I wonder what you would nominate as something that just seemed to draw a line where you thought, this cannot get any more bizarre.
Well, that's how, I try to tell people that the people in the United States are the most propagandized people in the world, but they don't know it. That's the difference between people in China and the United States. In China, they know they're seeing propaganda. And in the United States, they don't. They think they're getting the real news, right? And so we can't tell the difference between a freedom fighter and a Nazi. We look at the truckers in Canada, who, by the way, were vaccinated at a higher rate than the general population. They weren't protesting medicine. They were protesting authoritarianism, and they were right. And in America, we look at the freedom-fighting truckers and we call them Nazis, and we look at the Nazis in Ukraine and we call them freedom fighters. That's how backwards and twisted it is. And then Justin Trudeau went and he. By the way, I bumped into that when I was in Canada. I bumped into Justin Trudeau. I was going to a meeting of guys who saw the Barbie movie Alone, and anyway, I'll leave it there.
When and we've become, I was a political kind of atheist really for most of my life. I was always really in a situation where I just had to hold my nose and vote for somebody so that I could say that I had taken part in the democratic process. I've never been a fan of anyone particularly, but I wonder what you think of what could happen in the United States in November, that for the first time in a long time, it looks as if it's actually a three-person race, a three-man race. I wondered what you thought of the effect that Bobby Kennedy Jr. was having.
Well, you can see why they want to keep Bobby Kennedy off television, because when he comes on and he talks about Ukraine or he talks about health policies or COVID, he makes a lot of sense and he's referenced. It's a heartbreaker for me to see Bobby Kennedy wreck his peace candidacy with his a blinding support of Israel during the Israel-Gaza conflict right now. And, the problem with people with the same problem with Ukraine is the same problem with Israel-Gaza. People want to start the story with Ukraine at the third act. The third act is when Russia invaded. They don't know anything about the CIA and the United States got together to overthrow Ukraine's democratically elected government. And then the people in the eastern part of Ukraine and the Donbass, the Russian ethnic speakers, didn't want to go along with the coup government. So they started shelling them. And so then they had to have a peace agreement, Minsk 1 and 2. Guess who broke that peace agreement? It wasn't the people in the Donbass. It wasn't Russia. It was the Ukrainian government. So when Putin invaded, it wasn't to start a war. It was to end a war. They never tell you that for the first two acts. They never tell you about. Same thing. They start October 7th. They start the Israel-Gaza conflict on October 7th. They never tell you about the Nakba. They never tell you about the mowing of the lawn. They never tell you about that it's an occupied territory. They never tell you about the land grabs in the West, and they never tell you about the $500 billion in gas and oil that's underneath Gaza and offshore. They never tell you about any of that stuff. So that's a big problem. And I love Bobby Kennedy. He's such a useful voice, and I can't cut people out of my life anymore because I disagree with them, even if it's on a giant topic like Israel-Gaza. Because if I cut everybody out of my life who was wrong about COVID, and everybody out of my life who's wrong about Ukraine, and everybody out of my life who's wrong about Russiagate and Israel-Gaza, it would be a very narrow life. So my theory is to keep engaging these people, and that's what Kennedy does around vaccines, and he does it around COVID and things like that, and it's very useful. So that's what. So I think Bobby Kennedy's a great voice. It's a tragedy he wrecked his peace candidacy because he was a great voice on Ukraine.
It has struck me that I wonder if it must surely have been an unintended consequence of what Israel has been doing, that so many people of many ages and all around the world are now educating themselves and each other about, like you see, the coming into Ukraine in the third act. People have rewound the story of the Middle East to 1946, 47, 48. The Deir Yassin massacre and the Nakba and the rest of it, which it surely wasn't the intended effect that so many people would be beginning to look at that story in the round in the way that they are now.
Well, I was one of those people. So I'd even covered many of the conflicts and many of the military incursions from Israel into Gaza on my show. I have a public radio show here since 2010. And but I didn't really know the backstory, right? I was only covering what was happening that day. And so it wasn't until October 7th and then this unbelievable over-response from the Israeli government to October 7th. It wasn't until then that I actually found I didn't know anything about the Nakba. I didn't really understand that they were controlling the movement of the Palestinian people and that it was an apartheid state and that they actually were counting their calories and all the craziness that has gone on. So I didn't, but now I do. And I see videos on TikTok from people who are Jewish who were former Zionists saying that I didn't know what Zionist even meant until now. Either did I. And so now I do. So now I'm actually, so the unintended consequence is exactly right. Now people are waking up and they're being educated about what's happening. And the reason why they have to shut down these college protests is because the CEO of Palantir admitted on a panel, he said, if we lose this intellectual debate, we'll never be able to deploy an army again, a Western army anywhere in the world again. So that's why they have to shut this down, because they know they're losing the debate. And that's why they're overreacting and they're being so brutal. So the irony is that the people in the West, the right wing I hate to use right wing, left wing because it's so mixed now, but the people who have been anti-woke culture, right, which I agree with, they have always rallied and railed against the administration of colleges and universities, especially the elite ones, because of their wokeness, because they're so liberal and communist. And now they're siding with those people as they suppress the free speech of the peaceful protesters against the Gaza war. So that's the ultimate irony. I have to remind them, you know who you're siding with, right? You're siding with the establishment, the military-industrial complex, and the people you've hated for the last 20 years who you say are woke communists. So that's the irony.
Jimmy Dore, I'm so delighted that I was able to reach you for this week. I very much hope that this is just the first of many conversations and that I'll be able to pick up some of these topics and whatever else is happening in the world on another date not too far off. Thank you, Jimmy Dore.
It's a real thrill to be with you. Thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan also.
Excellent, Jimmy Dore. That's it for this week. Thank you, Jasmine, for staying there. I was very much enjoying the approving sounds that were coming from you with everything that Jimmy Dore was saying. That's all from the Neil Oliver Show on GB News and online this week. I will be back next week, all being equal. Thank you for now.